When I first saw her, she was standing at the edge of the lake, a solitary figure barely visible through the dense morning mist. The scene was serene. The water lay still, reflecting the gray sky like a giant mirror. It was my first morning at the cabin, a getaway I had planned to escape the suffocating noise of the city and the pressure of a deadline for an article. Yet, even in the peaceful quiet of nature, something about her presence unsettled me. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her silhouette stiff and unnatural, as if she were part of the mist. I watched her for a moment, unsure if I should approach. She wore a pale dress that looked oddly out of place, its frayed hem brushing against her bare feet. Her hair hung in long strands, swaying slightly in the breeze. Despite the distance, I could feel a strange magnetism that made it hard to look away. I thought to myself, she must be a local, perhaps someone seeking solace by the water, just as I had come here to find peace. I had paused a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. "Good morning," I called out, my voice breaking the fragile stillness of the scene. She didn't react at first, her focus fixed on the lake as though I wasn't even there. I stepped closer, unsure if she had heard me. Her dress, now visible in the weak morning light, looked old, like something from a different era. "Do you live around here?" I tried again, my tone friendlier, though my pulse quickened with each step. She turned, her movements slow, almost as if the air around her were thicker than mine. Her face was pale, her features delicate yet strangely sharp, and her eyes were deep and dark. She studied me for a moment, her lips curving into the faintest smile.
"It's so peaceful here,"
she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper.
"but it hides so much."
The way she spoke, detached, as if she were recalling something long forgotten, sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence between us stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until she turned back to the lake. It was clear she didn't want to talk, or perhaps couldn't. I lingered for a moment, unsure whether to leave or try again, but something about her stillness, the way she seemed almost fused with the mist, made me retreat. As I walked back toward the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder. She was still standing there, her figure barely visible now through the thickening fog. I told myself she was just another visitor, someone who had found this place for the same reasons I had. To escape, to reflect. But as I closed the cabin door behind me, her words replayed in my mind.
"It hides so much."
What did she mean? The lake? The forest? The unease I felt standing near her lingered long into the afternoon. That first encounter stayed in my thoughts as I went about my day. I spent the afternoon attempting to focus on my writing, but the blank page on my laptop glared at me. My usual flow of ideas was gone, replaced by fleeting images of her pale face, her dark eyes, and that strange, knowing smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than she had let on. The memory of how she stood so still, as though she were part of the mist itself, made my chest tighten with an unease I couldn't name. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, unable to shake the image of her, standing by the water, her dark hair clinging to her face. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again.
"It hides so much."
Sleep came in restless fits, plagued by fragmented dreams of the lake. In them, the water seemed endless, stretching into an abyss, and she was always there, watching. Her shadow loomed larger than life, swallowing the light, until all I could see was her face. I woke in a cold sweat, the echo of her presence still pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. As the first light of dawn crept into the cabin, I sat by the window, staring out at the lake, unable to shake the certainty that this wasn't just a chance encounter. She wasn't just another visitor. And I had the terrible feeling I was about to find out what her words meant. The next morning, I found myself drawn back to the lake, even though I had no real reason to go. When I arrived, she was already there, standing in the same spot as before, her bare feet half hidden by the damp grass. The mist was thicker that day, swirling lazily around her as though it were alive. I hesitated, debating whether to approach her again. There was something about her presence that was both compelling and unsettling, like standing on the edge of a cliff. This time, I approached slowly, clearing my throat to announce myself. "Do you come here often?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. She turned to look at me, her movements as delicate as they had been the day before. Her dark eyes lingered on mine for a moment, as if weighing my worth, before she answered.
"Every day,"
she said softly, her voice almost lost in the whisper of the wind.
"This place, it calls to me."
Her words sent a shiver through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but my unease was growing. She didn't answer right away, her gaze drifting back to the water.
"There's a lot beneath the surface, things people forget. Things people leave behind."
The way she murmured the words was strange, almost poetic. It was as if she wasn't just talking about the lake but something far deeper, something I couldn't see. I tried to brush off the feeling, forcing a smile. "Are you a writer?" I asked, half joking. "You sound like one." Her lips twitched, but it wasn't quite a smile.
"No, but I know stories. The kind people don't like to tell."
Her gaze fixed on the lake again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something ripple beneath the surface, though the water was calm. My instinct told me to leave, to go back to the cabin and put some distance between myself and this strange woman. But I couldn't. There was a magnetism about her, something that made it impossible to walk away. "What kind of stories?" I asked, my voice quieter now. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer to the water, her reflection blurring in the ripples.
"You'll see,"
she said finally, so softly I almost didn't hear her. The way she said it made my skin crawl, and yet I didn't press her further. I just stood there, watching, as she stared out at the lake. When I finally turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that her eyes were still on me, even as I walked away. Over the next week, I saw her every day. She was always by the lake, always in the same spot, her bare feet brushing the edge of the water as if she belonged there. The more I saw her, the more unsettling it became. She never seemed to change, not her posture, not her clothes, not the faint, distant expression on her face. It was as though she were frozen in time, like a photograph brought to life. I began trying to engage her in conversation, though she rarely gave more than cryptic answers. Despite the unease, I couldn't stop going back. I began to feel like I was caught in an invisible web, each encounter pulling me deeper into a connection I didn't understand. My days revolved around her now. In the mornings, I would sit on the far side of the lake, pretending to write, though I spent more time watching her than working. At night, I would sit by the cabin window, staring out at the darkened lake and wondering if she was still there, standing in the moonlight like a ghost. In my dreams, she was always humming a strange and hypnotizing melody. Her figure partially submerged in the icy, rippling water of the lake. Her dress clung to her frame, and her dark hair floated around her face like tendrils of shadow. Each time I tried to move toward her, the ground beneath me gave way. The earth would crumble into nothingness, and I'd plunge into the cold abyss. The water closed over my head, its icy grip choking me, and I would wake just before I drowned. I began to dread falling asleep, and worse still, I started to feel her presence during the day, even when I was wide awake. At first, it was just an odd sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck when I stood near the lake or glanced at its still surface from the cabin window. But then it became more tangible. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of her figure in the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't be sure if she was real or a trick of the light. The line between my waking life and the dreams began to blur. On one particularly foggy afternoon, I swore I heard her humming that same melody from my nightmares, the sound drifting through the forest like a siren's call. When I stepped outside to investigate, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the silence of the woods. She wasn't just haunting my nights anymore, she was invading my reality. One stormy night, I couldn't resist the pull of the lake. The rain hammered against the cabin roof, and the wind howled, like a chorus of voices, urging me forward. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The beam of light wavered in my trembling hand as I made my way down the path toward the lake. The storm was relentless, the rain drenching me within moments. The ground was slick with mud, and the trees swayed violently, their branches creaking like old bones. The lake came into view, its surface churning under the relentless assault of the wind. And there she was. Exactly where I knew she would be, standing at the water's edge. Her dress clung to her body, soaked through and heavy, but she didn't seem to notice. Her dark hair whipped around her face, and yet her expression remained calm, almost serene.
"Why are you here?"
I shouted over the storm, my voice barely audible above the howling wind. She turned to face me slowly, as though the chaos around us didn't touch her. The flashlight's beam landed on her face, and for a moment, I was struck by how unnatural she looked. Her eyes seemed darker than before, almost bottomless, and her skin had taken on an otherworldly pallor.
You already know,
she said, her voice clear and steady despite the noise around us. I took a step closer, the mud sucking at my boots as I approached.
"No, I don't know. Tell me what you want from me."
I yelled, frustration and fear boiling over. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips.
It's not what I want. It's what you need to see.
Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the rain. She stepped backward into the lake, the water swallowing her feet and ankles as if it were alive. The ripples radiated out unnaturally, distorting the surface in ways that didn't make sense. I froze, unsure of whether to follow or run.
Come closer, you're already a part of this,
she said, her voice soft and melodic, cutting through the storm like a knife. I wanted to move, to get away from her and the strange pull of the lake, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Her hand extended toward me, pale and delicate, beckoning. I don't know what compelled me to step into the water. Maybe it was her voice, soft and otherworldly. I couldn't resist. The water was icy, biting against my skin as I waded in, each step pulling me deeper into its grip. The mud at the bottom was slick and unsteady, sucking at my boots, making every movement feel heavier than the last. She stood ahead of me, waist deep now, her pale form shimmering like a mirage in the flickering beam of my flashlight.
Come and see,
she said again. My chest tightened as I stepped further in, the water rising to my knees, then my thighs, its chill spreading through my entire body.
"See what?"
I demanded, my voice trembling. The flashlight flickered again, the beam barely illuminating her now. She didn't answer, only extended her hand further, her eyes locking onto mine.
It's already begun,
she whispered, and I couldn't tell if she was speaking to me or to the lake itself. I looked down and froze. The water was no longer clear. A dark, inky substance was spreading around me, swirling and coiling like living shadows beneath the surface. Panic surged through me, and I tried to step back, but the mud held me fast. I glanced back at her, my breath hitching as I saw her face. It wasn't the face of the woman I had been speaking to, it was changing. Her features stretched and twisted, her mouth curling into a smile that was too wide, her eyes glowing faintly like two distant, flickering stars.
What are you?
I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the roaring wind. Her smile widened even further.
I am what you've been searching for,
she said, her words chilling in their simplicity. Before I could respond, the water surged around me, pulling me forward with an unseen force. My flashlight slipped from my hand, its beam vanishing as it sank into the depths. The lake rose higher, up to my chest now, the black tendrils curling around my arms and legs. I struggled, but it was useless. The harder I fought, the tighter their grip became, as if the lake itself were alive and determined to claim me. Through the chaos, she stood motionless, watching with an expression that was equal parts triumph and pity. She said softly, her voice the last thing I heard before the water closed over my head.
You were always meant to come here.
When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the shore, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. The first rays of dawn pierced through the trees, casting a dim light over the lake's surface, which was now eerily calm, as if the storm had never happened. My body ached, my chest burned with each breath, and my head throbbed as if I'd been struck. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but the taste of mud in my mouth and the icy chill seeping into my bones reminded me that this was all too real. I pushed myself up on shaky arms, my vision swimming as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The woman was gone. There was no trace of her, no footprints in the muddy shore, no ripples in the water where she had stood. The flashlight I had carried was nowhere to be seen, likely lost in the lake's depths. As I staggered to my feet, I replayed the events of the night in my mind, but they didn't add up. The darkness in the water, her shifting face, the way the lake had seemed alive, all of it felt impossible. Yet, here I was, soaked and trembling, the evidence of the encounter written on my body. And the memory of her voice lingered, clear and undeniable.
You were always meant to come here.
I stumbled back to the cabin, every step a fight against the overwhelming cold and exhaustion. My clothes were soaked through, my boots caked with mud, and the images from the lake were burned into my mind, the black tendrils in the water, her pale face watching, and that terrible smile as the abyss pulled at me. I should have fled. I should have packed my things and left the cabin, the lake, and the woman behind. But something compelled me to stay. After changing into dry clothes, I sat in front of my laptop, my fingers trembling as I opened a browser. I needed answers, anything to make sense of what had happened. I started with local history, typing the lake's name into the search bar. Dozens of articles appeared, missing persons, tragic drownings, and, most chilling of all, stories of a ghostly figure tied to the lake. One headline caught my attention, the disappearance of Emily Reed. The accompanying photograph was grainy, but her face was unmistakable. Pale, sharp features framed by dark hair. Her haunting eyes, staring straight into the camera. The article detailed how she had vanished decades ago, presumed drowned in the lake. Some locals believed she had taken her own life after being rejected by her lover. Emily Reed was a young woman from a respected local family, known for her beauty and quiet demeanor. She was engaged to a man named Samuel, a traveling merchant who had swept her off her feet with promises of a grand future. Their wedding was set to take place by the lake. But on the day of the ceremony, Samuel never arrived. Witnesses recalled seeing Emily standing alone at the altar, her white dress catching in the breeze, as the hours dragged on. Eventually, it became clear he wasn't coming. Betrayed and humiliated, Emily disappeared that evening. Some claim they saw her walking toward the lake as the sun set, her wedding gown trailing in the dirt. By the next morning, only her veil was found floating near the shore. Though her body was never recovered, the town whispered of a bride consumed by despair, taking her own life in the same place where she had once dreamed of happiness. I clicked on a second link, then a third, my pulse quickening with each discovery. Buried in one of the articles was an old group photograph of townsfolk near the lake, taken just before Emily's disappearance. My breath caught in my throat. Among the smiling faces was a man who looked exactly like me. Same eyes. Same build. Even the way he stood felt familiar. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding as I scrutinized the details. It wasn't possible. The photograph was dated nearly 80 years ago. But the resemblance was undeniable. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together the impossible. Was it a relative? A coincidence? Or was it something far stranger? And then it hit me. The cryptic words she had spoken.
You were always meant to come here.
And now, I knew why I felt so drawn to her. This wasn't my first life. It wasn't my first encounter with Emily, or the lake. I had been here before. As the truth settled over me, it felt like a weight too heavy to bear. The man in the photograph, Samuel, wasn't just someone I resembled. He was me. It explained everything. The pull I felt toward the lake, the sense of familiarity that had haunted me since I arrived, and Emily's cryptic words. I had betrayed her. I had left her alone on what should have been the happiest day of her life, and she had paid for it with her own. The lake had kept her grief, her anger, alive, binding her to its depths, and now it had brought me back, lifetimes later, to face the consequences. The cabin seemed to shrink around me as I realized what would come next. I wasn't here by chance, I was here to pay the price for what I had done. Emily's sorrow had festered into something darker, and now, it was time for her vengeance. The lake wasn't just a place of tragedy. It was a place of reckoning. And this time, there would be no escape.